The night I lost my job, the world seemed to collapse around me. Still, I held back the tears as my son, Jake, barely looked up from his phone and muttered, "I hope this doesn't affect anything." As my daughter-in-law, Emily, tossed a harsh failure my way, the weight of her words hit me like a punch. While I packed my things, I realized how little they saw me. That's when I knew they'd soon regret it. I wasn't their burden anymore. It was time to show them what true strength really looks like. All right, before we dive into this crazy story, do me a favor. Subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. Helen Carter sat in her car outside the office building, staring at the glass doors, her hands clutching the steering wheel. The words still echoed in her mind, a broken record she couldn't escape. Your position has been eliminated. She could still feel the finality in her chest, the suffocating weight of it. After 30 years of loyalty, of quiet sacrifice, she had been discarded. Downsizing, they said. It was always downsizing, never the recognition she deserved. She turned the engine off with a mechanical click, her eyes tracing the suburban skyline of Chicago as if it could offer some comfort. But nothing could soften the sharp ache lodged in her ribs. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the neighborhood. She had a good life, a life that now felt like it had been built on shifting sand. It wasn't just the job, it was everything. She had poured herself into supporting Daniel, into maintaining the illusion of a perfect family, always the dependable mother, the stable presence. And now, at 58, she had nothing, not even her own sense of self. Helen took a deep breath and forced herself out of the car. She had to face Daniel. She had to tell him. The door clicked open with a familiar creak as she entered their house. The smell of takeout lingered in the air, and she could hear the murmur of voices from the kitchen. Daniel and Rachel were there, as usual, wrapped up in their own world. She stood still for a moment, her fingers brushing against the doorframe, steeling herself. "Hey, Mom, you're home late." Daniel's voice floated toward her, and she could hear the TV blaring in the background. He didn't even look up from his phone. Helen swallowed hard, her pulse quickening. She hadn't expected to feel so small, not in her own home. She cleared her throat. "I need to talk to both of you." Rachel, sitting at the table with her phone in hand, glanced up. Her smile was thin, a polite formality. "Everything okay, Helen?" The casualness of her tone made Helen's stomach twist. She nodded, trying to steady her voice. "I lost my job today." There, it was out. She braced herself, not knowing what to expect. Daniel looked up, his face shifting from indifference to a flash of irritation. "What do you mean, you lost your job?" His voice rose slightly, not out of concern, but frustration. "They downsized," Helen explained quietly, her eyes dropping to the floor. "My position was eliminated." "Great," Daniel muttered under his breath. "I hope this doesn't affect anything too badly." Helen's heart sank. Too badly. She had spent years making sure his life was smooth, that he never had to worry about anything. And now this hollow response from him was all she got. Rachel set her phone down, her gaze hardening. "So, that's it, huh? You couldn't even keep a job?" She sneered, her voice laced with condescension. "You really are a failure, aren't you?" The words stung more than Helen could have imagined. Failure. She had worked so hard, given up so much. And now, this. She opened her mouth to defend herself, but Rachel's voice cut through. "You're what, 58 now? Maybe it's time to stop pretending you can keep up," Rachel said, her tone dripping with disdain. "Maybe it's time to just let go. You can't even hold on to a job." Helen felt the heat rise to her face, her cheeks burning with humiliation. She had hoped for some understanding, perhaps even a glimmer of sympathy. Instead, she was met with mockery. She turned to Daniel, seeking something, anything that might indicate he cared. Daniel, I need your help. But instead of concern, she saw annoyance flicker across his face. He pushed his chair back, standing up slowly. Look, Mom, I really don't have time for this right now, he said, his tone sharp. You need to figure this out on your own. It's not my problem. Helen's knees felt weak, but she forced herself to stay upright, her throat closing with the weight of his words. She wanted to scream, to plead for his understanding, but she knew it would do no good. His eyes, cold and detached, had already closed the door between them. Daniel, she began, but he cut her off. Just go somewhere else. Take some time to figure things out. He gestured toward the door. We can't help you right now. Her chest tightened. She felt the sting of his rejection like a slap across the face. The life she had built, the relationships she had nurtured, everything felt like it was slipping through her fingers. Without another word, she turned and walked toward the door, the cold weight of their judgment pressing against her. Every step felt heavier than the last, but she had no choice. The house, the family she had fought for, no longer felt like home. The door shut behind her with a soft click, and Helen stood on the porch, trembling. She wanted to break down, to collapse, but she couldn't. Not now. She had been dismissed, cast aside, but there was no going back. She wouldn't let herself be a victim of their cruelty, not anymore. As she made her way down the steps into the evening, her heart still pounding, she realized something she hadn't expected. She was free, and in that moment, with the cool night air surrounding her, she made a vow to herself. She would rise again. Without them, the world was waiting. And for the first time in a long time, Helen Carter was ready to take the first step. And as she walked into the night, the door of her old life slammed shut, forever. The drive to Linda's house felt longer than it should have, even though it was only a few miles. Helen had always admired the old bungalow, with its wide windows and the overgrown ivy creeping along the brick. It seemed so alive, so full of history. The perfect place for someone who had lived her life in quiet routine to start anew. But as she pulled up to the curb, the weight of her decisions pressed down on her chest, heavier than the boxes she had packed in the back seat. She parked, staring at the front door. Linda would be waiting. Linda always waited. Helen took a slow, steadying breath and stepped out of the car. The air was cool, a welcome contrast to the suffocating heat of her own mind. As she walked up the path, she could feel the silence of the night all around her, a stark contrast to the chaos inside her head. Linda was waiting on the porch, a soft smile gracing her face. Her best friend. The only one who had never judged her, never questioned her choices. Hey, Linda greeted, her arms open as Helen reached the top of the steps. She didn't need to say anything more. Helen just walked into her embrace, the comfort of it swallowing her up. I don't know where to begin, Helen whispered, her voice breaking slightly. She could feel the tremor in her hands. You don't have to begin anywhere, Hel, Linda said, pulling back slightly to look her in the eyes. You're here now, and that's all that matters. You've already taken the hardest step. Helen nodded, her throat tight. I don't know who I am anymore, Linda. I've lost everything. My job, my family, the way I thought my life was supposed to be. What do I even do now? Linda's expression softened. You focus on you. Take control of your future. You've spent so many years putting everyone else first. It's time to put yourself at the top of your list. The words hung in the air, and Helen felt a spark of something she hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. She wasn't sure how to get there, but Linda was right. She couldn't keep sinking into the shadow of her past. It was time to rebuild, to rediscover the woman she used to be. The woman who had dreams, passions, and desires beyond family obligations. Okay, Helen said quietly, almost to herself. Okay. That night, Linda set her up in the guest room, and they sat together at the kitchen table, a pot of herbal tea between them. The conversation was easy, flowing naturally as if it had always been this way. They talked about Helen's life, the frustrations, the dreams she'd let slip through her fingers. By the time they were done, the clock had pushed past midnight. Linda reached over, placing a hand gently over Helen's. "You've got to think bigger, Helen," Linda said, her voice steady but filled with conviction. "It's not just about finding a job, it's about reclaiming your life. What makes you happy? What have you always wanted to do but put off because you thought it was too late?" Helen blinked at the question, her mind spinning. She had spent her whole life thinking in terms of what she could give to others, never what she could give to herself. "I've always wanted to write," Helen said, the words coming out before she could stop them. "Creative writing. But I thought I was too old for that. It always felt too impractical." "Why is it impractical?" Linda leaned forward, her eyes bright with excitement. "If it's what you love, then it's the most practical thing you can do. What's the worst that could happen? You might fail? At least you'll have tried, and you might succeed. You never know unless you go for it." Helen felt a shift in her chest, a loosening, a quiet stirring of something buried deep inside. "Maybe I could take a class," she said, the idea gaining momentum in her mind. "Something just for me." Linda grinned. "Exactly. That's the spirit. And don't stop there, Hel. There's a whole world of possibilities waiting for you. You've spent so long being the reliable one for everyone else. It's time to be the reliable one for yourself." The next morning, Helen woke up early. The house was still, and the first light of dawn stretched across the kitchen table where she sat with her laptop open in front of her. With Linda's encouragement, she had already started looking into writing classes, online and in person, and had signed up for an introductory creative writing course. It felt surreal, but liberating at the same time. Her phone buzzed on the table, interrupting the quiet hum of the morning. A text message from Daniel. "We need to talk. Call me when you get a chance." Helen stared at the message, her heart sinking. A part of her had hoped he might reach out to apologize, but the familiar transactional tone of his words felt cold. She thought about calling him, but then she remembered Linda's advice. This wasn't about them anymore. It was about her. She set the phone aside, ignoring the growing number of messages from Daniel and Rachel. It wasn't that she didn't care, but she needed space. She needed time to breathe, time to rebuild. That afternoon, Helen attended her first networking event for creative professionals, a small meetup at a local coffee shop. She felt out of place at first, awkward in her worn jeans and simple blouse, but as the event went on, she began to relax. She found herself chatting with a group of women who were all starting their own businesses or creative endeavors. Their stories were varied, but the shared sense of reinvention resonated deeply with her. By the time the event ended, Helen felt like she had found a community, a group of women who understood what it meant to take a risk, to start again. She exchanged business cards, made promises to keep in touch, and for the first time in a long while, she felt a flicker of excitement. When Helen returned home that night, she sat with Linda, her heart full of newfound energy. "I think I might have an idea for something of my own," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Linda smiled, already knowing what Helen needed to say. "I want to start a business, something creative, handmade candles and home decor. Something simple, but meaningful. I've always loved making things. I think I could make it work." Linda's face lit up. "I think that's perfect. Let's make it happen." Helen smiled for the first time in days, a sense of determination growing in her chest. She wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, she felt ready to face it. And maybe, just maybe, she would finally become the woman she had always wanted to be. The first step had been taken, and she was ready for the next one. The craft fair was small, tucked in the corner of a community center in the outskirts of Chicago. The air smelled of fresh coffee and baked goods, mingling with the earthy scent of handmade soaps and candles. Helen stood behind a fold-out table, her handmade candles arranged in neat rows, their flickering flames casting a warm glow against the dreary, overcast day. She had spent the last few weeks preparing for this, assembling the delicate wax, choosing the perfect scents, labeling each one with care. She couldn't believe she was finally here, doing this thing she had once only dreamed of. Her heart raced with a mix of excitement and nerves. She had spent decades in the shadow of family obligations, never daring to step outside the familiar. Now, she was taking a risk. There was no safety net, no cushion to soften the fall. This was it. She greeted the first customers with a smile, her hands trembling slightly as she handed them the small, intricately scented candles. To her surprise, the first few sold quickly. Then more followed. By the end of the afternoon, Helen's entire booth was empty. She couldn't believe it. She had sold out. She had stepped into the unknown and had been met with success. "Looks like we need to restock for the next fair," Linda said with a grin, standing beside Helen and surveying the empty table. "This is just the beginning." Helen's face lit up with disbelief and joy. "I can't believe it. I've never done anything like this before." The feeling of accomplishment was like nothing she had ever experienced. It was her work, her passion, finally appreciated by someone other than herself. That evening, as they packed up, Helen felt a sense of pride swelling in her chest. But the next day, as she sat in her small apartment, the ringing of her phone interrupted the silence. It was Rachel. Helen stared at the screen, her stomach twisting. She had hoped that Rachel would leave her alone for a while, but it seemed the pressure was too much. She answered the call, her voice steady but guarded. "Mom, I've been trying to reach you." Rachel's voice dripped with a mixture of guilt and frustration. "You've been gone for weeks. The house is a mess, and we're struggling. I need you to come back and help out." Helen's heart thudded in her chest. The old instincts, the ones that had always made her put others before herself, tugged at her. But she was stronger now. She had found something for herself, and nothing, not even Rachel's manipulations, would take that away. "I'm not coming back, Rachel," Helen said firmly. "I have my own life now, my own path. You and Daniel need to figure things out on your own. I can't keep sacrificing myself for you." There was a long pause on the other end of the line, followed by a frustrated sigh. "I'm just asking you to help out, Mom. What's so wrong with that? You don't need to be alone. You're just making things harder on yourself." Helen took a deep breath. "It's not about being alone, Rachel. It's about finally choosing what's best for me. And that means not coming back." She ended the call without another word, feeling a strange mix of guilt and liberation. But deep down, she knew she had made the right choice. It wasn't easy, but it was necessary. Days passed, and Helen's business began to pick up momentum. She registered an online store and started receiving orders for custom candles and home decor. She felt an overwhelming sense of accomplishment as she filled each order herself, handcrafting every piece with care. With each sale, she gained confidence, not just in her business but in herself. One morning, as she sorted through her growing list of orders, her phone buzzed again. This time, it was Daniel. He was asking to meet. Helen stared at the message for a moment, her finger hovering over the screen. There was a part of her that wanted to say yes, to try to repair the broken bond. But then she thought of how he had treated her, how quickly he had cast her aside when things got tough. Her finger swiped across the screen, typing a single response. "I'm focused on my new path, Daniel. I hope you understand." She sent it and set the phone down, a feeling of finality settling in her chest. She had spent so many years chasing after people who would never value her. Now, she was chasing something that was hers alone. And it felt good. It felt right. Her business flourished. She started to see her name mentioned in local blogs and magazines, and customers were returning for more. Helen was becoming a fixture in the community, an unexpected success story that people admired. One afternoon, as she walked to her small studio, she passed by a local cafe where a few of her old friends were sitting. She hadn't seen them in years, but as soon as they saw her, their faces lit up. They waved her over, and Helen couldn't help but smile as she joined them. It felt good to reconnect with people who had seen her through the years, not just as a mother or a wife, but as Helen. "How's the business going?" one of them, Jill, asked. She was a freelance photographer, always with a new project in the works. "It's going better than I ever imagined," Helen replied, her eyes shining. "I'm still getting the hang of it, but it's mine, you know? Every sale, every customer. It's all because I took that first step." "I'm proud of you, Helen," Jill said. "I always knew you had it in you." Helen felt a wave of warmth. She had finally found a piece of herself that she had long buried. Her independence wasn't just about the business. It was about rediscovering her own value, her own worth. But just as the conversation flowed easily, Helen's phone buzzed again. This time, it was a notification from her online store. Another order, another step forward. She smiled to herself, feeling the quiet satisfaction of her success. The past was behind her, and the future, her future, was unfolding, one step at a time. And as she stood up to leave the cafe, her heart light and her mind clear, she knew that this was only the beginning. Helen had just finished packing up her latest batch of candles when the knock came at the door. A sharp, quick tap that shattered the calm of her small apartment. She wasn't expecting anyone. Her heart skipped as she walked toward the door, the familiar sensation of tension creeping up her spine. When she opened it, Daniel and Rachel stood on her doorstep. Both of them, their faces uncomfortably earnest, their postures stiff, as though they had rehearsed their words, but now weren't sure how to begin. "Mom," Daniel said, his voice a little softer than usual, though still carrying that undercurrent of expectation. We need to talk." Helen's stomach clenched. She had tried to shut out thoughts of them. She had told herself that she didn't need their approval, didn't need them in her life the way she once had. But standing here, seeing them again, the old reflexes kicked in, her need to please, to smooth over awkwardness. Rachel shifted on her feet, glancing at Daniel before looking back at Helen. There was a flicker of guilt in her eyes, but it was fleeting, replaced by a more familiar hardness. "We've been talking," she said. Her tone clipped, "and we both know things have gotten out of hand. We've acted out of line." Helen stood still for a moment, her fingers clutching the edge of the door. The weight of their presence in her life was suffocating. She had hoped this day would never come, the day when they would reappear, seeking forgiveness, seeking to undo the hurt they had caused. But now that they were here, she knew what she had to do. "I'm sorry, Mom," Daniel continued, his voice lower now, almost pleading. "I shouldn't have said the things I did. I was frustrated, but it wasn't right. I never should have asked you to leave." Helen didn't respond immediately. Her thoughts swirled, the emotions thick and tangled. Part of her wanted to believe him, to feel relief that maybe, just maybe, they had finally seen the error of their ways. But another part of her, a deeper, quieter part, knew that their words, their actions, had cut her to the bone, and she wasn't sure she could forgive that so easily. Rachel, sensing the hesitation, stepped forward. "You don't have to do this alone, Helen," she said, her voice softer now. "We're family. You've been through so much. You're welcome to come back home. We'll make things work. You don't have to keep struggling like this. The offer hung in the air, and for a moment Helen was paralyzed. The temptation was there, the pull of familiarity, the comfort of the life she had once known. But it was just that, the life she had known. It wasn't the life she had now. It wasn't the life she had built. No, Helen said, her voice quiet but steady. I've made my decision. I'm not coming back. I'm not going to keep being your burden. Rachel. Rachel's face tightened. Burden? Is that really how you see this? We're just trying to help. You're making things harder on yourself. I'm not making things harder, Helen replied, her tone firming. I'm choosing my own path. And that doesn't include being your housekeeper, your charity case. I've spent years doing things for you both, and look where that's gotten me. Her breath caught in her throat, and she looked at Daniel, her eyes locking with his. I'm not your responsibility, and I'm not going to let you make me feel like I'm a failure for wanting to live my own life. Daniel's jaw clenched. This is ridiculous, Mom. You think I'm trying to make you feel like a failure? You don't have to be so dramatic about it. Helen's heart beat faster, a rush of anger rising up in her chest. She had heard this before. The dismissal, the invalidation. It was never enough. She was never enough. No, Daniel, she said, her voice colder now. You made it very clear what you thought of me when you kicked me out. You weren't thinking about what I needed, what I wanted. You only thought about yourself. Rachel stepped in, her voice rising. Helen, you're being unreasonable. We're offering to help, and you're throwing it back in our faces. Helen took a deep breath, closing her eyes for a moment. She felt the familiar sting of tears, but she refused to let them fall. This wasn't about them. This was about her. I'm not asking for your help anymore, Helen said, her voice unwavering. I'm not asking for your approval. I'm done with that. You've made it clear how little you value me, and now it's my turn to make my own choices. To find my own worth. The silence that followed was thick, suffocating. Daniel shifted his weight, his face flushed with anger, but Helen didn't flinch. She stood her ground. I'm not going to beg you to understand, she continued, her gaze steady. And I'm not coming back. I'm not your problem anymore. For a moment, neither of them said anything. It was as if they were both processing the weight of her words. Finally, Daniel spoke, his voice tight with frustration. Fine, if that's how you want it. Rachel's lips twisted into a faint sneer. I just don't get it, she muttered, turning away. You've lost your mind. Helen didn't respond. She simply watched them, her heart heavy, but lighter in a way. She had said what needed to be said. She had set the boundaries that she should have set years ago. As they turned to leave, Helen felt a strange mixture of hurt and relief. She closed the door softly behind them, the finality of the action settling into her bones. She had given them every chance to change. And now, it was time to let go. It was time to move forward, no matter how painful. The door clicked shut. The silence in the apartment felt less oppressive than before. And for the first time in a long time, Helen felt free. The steady hum of the small studio was a comfort to Helen. It was a far cry from the sterile office spaces she had known in the past, but it was hers, a space she had created from the ground up. The scent of lavender and cinnamon filled the air as she carefully poured wax into the molds, the rhythmic motion of her hands grounding her. Her business was thriving. She could hardly believe it. It was hard to imagine that just a few months ago, she had been a woman who had felt completely lost, discarded by her own son, rejected by her family. Now, as she looked around the studio, filled with bright candles and hand-painted jars, she saw nothing but the evidence of her resilience. The first few weeks had been a blur of long days and sleepless nights, but things had changed. Helen had hired her first employee, a young woman named Sophie, whose enthusiasm and dedication matched her own. Sophie had been with her for only a month, but already she could see the spark of potential in the young woman. They worked side by side, creating new designs, experimenting with scents, and filling orders. The team had grown too, an experienced marketer and a few part-time crafters who helped with packaging and shipping. It was no longer just Helen. It was a team, a community, and that, more than anything, made her heart swell with pride. One Friday morning, Helen sat at her desk with her coffee mug in hand, scrolling through her phone as the latest local newsletter popped up. She paused as she read the headline, "Local Entrepreneur Brings Color and Light to the Community with Handmade Candles." Her name was there, beneath a picture of her booth at the last craft fair. Her heart skipped a beat. Recognition. She'd dreamed of it, but it felt so surreal now. The article spoke about her journey, how she'd rebuilt her life from scratch, and how her business was quickly becoming a staple in the neighborhood. Helen couldn't help but smile as she read the kind words of the journalist who had visited her studio. It was a quiet validation, but it was everything. She was finally being seen, not as a mother, not as someone's caretaker, but as Helen. The phone buzzed again, snapping her back to reality. It was another text from Daniel. She had stopped answering his calls weeks ago. His messages had become more insistent, increasingly desperate, but they always carried the same undertone, an unspoken expectation that she would return to them, return to the role of the dutiful mother, the woman who had no life outside of their needs. "We need to talk. It's been months, Mom. This can't keep going on. Please call me." Helen stared at the message for a moment, her finger hovering over the screen. She felt a faint pang of something. Guilt, maybe. But she pushed it down. Her life was no longer in their hands. She wasn't their responsibility anymore, and she wasn't going to let them pull her back into the suffocating patterns of the past. She set the phone down with a firm resolve, the same resolve that had carried her through the darkest days. She was building something here. A life. Her life. And it didn't involve her son and daughter-in-law's expectations. As the weeks passed, her business flourished. She had added new product lines, including a line of eco-friendly candles and handcrafted home decor. Each new product felt like a personal victory, a declaration that she was capable of creating something that mattered. Her online store was gaining traction, and the local community embraced her more and more, seeking out her work at fairs, markets, and even recommending her to friends. One afternoon, as Helen sat at her desk writing a new marketing campaign, Sophie walked in with a small package in hand. "For you," Sophie said, setting it on Helen's desk with a smile. Helen opened the package carefully, her heart quickening as she saw the contents. A plaque engraved with the words, "Entrepreneur of the Year." It was a local award, given annually to someone who had made a significant impact on the community. Helen's name was etched into the base of the plaque, and beneath it, the words, "For dedication, passion, and empowerment." Helen held the plaque for a moment, overwhelmed by the weight of the recognition. This was more than just a small business success. It was the acknowledgement of everything she had worked for, everything she had sacrificed. It was a symbol of her journey, of all the pain she had endured to reach this point. Sophie was grinning, watching her reaction. "You did it." "Helen, this is huge." Helen smiled, but it wasn't just pride she felt. It was peace. This was what success felt like. Not the hollow validation of others, but the quiet, steadfast knowing that she had built something meaningful, something she could call her own. As the day went on, she found herself thinking about the old version of herself, the one who had stood in her kitchen and made excuses for why she couldn't go after her dreams. That woman seemed so far away now, a distant memory of someone trapped in a life she hadn't chosen. But she wasn't that woman anymore. She had reclaimed her identity. She was Helen Carter, an entrepreneur. Later that week, she moved into a small apartment in a more vibrant part of the city. It wasn't anything extravagant, but it was hers. It was a tangible representation of her independence, a place where she could come home at the end of the day and feel the weight of her own decisions. There were no obligations here, no expectations, only the freedom to be herself. She continued to work on her business, growing steadily, but she also began to mentor young women in the community who wanted to start their own businesses. She saw so much of herself in them, the same uncertainty, the same doubt. But she also saw something she hadn't seen in herself before: the courage to take that first step. One evening, as she sat with a group of young women in her studio, talking about their goals and dreams, Helen realized that she had finally found her place in the world. She wasn't just building a business, she was building a legacy. Her success was no longer measured in dollars or products sold, but in the way she could inspire others to take control of their lives. She had gone from a woman who felt invisible to one who had found her voice, her purpose, and her worth. And for the first time in years, Helen felt completely at peace. The future, once so uncertain, was now wide open, waiting for her to continue creating the life she had always deserved. As she closed the door to her studio that night, she realized that she had already built the future she had dreamed of. And it had nothing to do with the people who had once tried to hold her back. It was hers, all hers. The grand ballroom was filled with soft light and the murmur of excited chatter. Women from all walks of life, from budding entrepreneurs to established industry leaders, milled about, exchanging stories, ideas, and business cards. It was the kind of event Helen had dreamed of attending for years, a gathering where her success, her hard-won journey, was celebrated. And tonight, it was her turn to be in the spotlight. She stood at the front of the room, her heart still racing as the host, a local community leader, announced her name. The applause was immediate, warm, and sincere. Helen felt the weight of it, the validation of so much hard work, so many sacrifices, and for the first time, she allowed herself to bask in it. She stood tall, a steady smile playing on her lips as she walked toward the stage. The crowd continued to applaud, and Helen's gaze swept the room, taking in the faces of people who admired her, not as a mother, not as someone's wife, but as an entrepreneur, as Helen Carter. From the back of the room, Daniel and Rachel watched, standing together yet separated by the unspoken distance between them. Rachel's arms were crossed, her face set in a mask of something that could almost be mistaken for pride. But Helen could see it, the tightness around her eyes, the slight twitch of her jaw. It wasn't pride, it was jealousy. Rachel's eyes tracked Helen's every move, her gaze flicking from the applause to the woman she had once dismissed. Daniel, standing just beside her, was a study in discomfort. He had never been good at pretending, and tonight, he felt like an imposter in the room. His suit, sharp and crisp, seemed at odds with the warmth of the people around him. As he looked at Helen, receiving her award, something inside him twisted, an ache he couldn't quite place. When the applause died down, Helen stepped forward to accept the award, her hands steady as she took the microphone. "Thank you," she said, her voice clear and confident. "This is not just my award, but the culmination of the hard work of so many people who believed in me along the way. To everyone who's helped me on this journey, thank you. To my team, my community, my family, this is for all of us." The crowd cheered again, and Helen smiled graciously, nodding at her supporters. She felt strong, more powerful than she had ever felt in her life. For so long, she had tried to fill the spaces in her heart with others' needs, but tonight, for the first time, she was truly filling herself with her own purpose. From the corner of the room, Rachel's smile faltered. She looked at her husband, her lips pressed together tightly. "She doesn't deserve this," she whispered, though her words were lost in the noise of the celebration. Daniel's gaze remained fixed on Helen. He watched her as she turned to leave the stage, greeted by a group of women eager to congratulate her. Her posture was confident now. There was no hesitation, no awkwardness. She was herself in a way he hadn't seen in years, not the woman who'd bent to his every whim, not the mother who had dropped everything to make sure his life was comfortable. She was something more, something he hadn't understood he needed. But the ache in his chest lingered. The weight of his past actions pressed down on him like a heavy stone. He had been blind to her strength, dismissive of her needs. All those years he had taken her for granted. And now, here she was, the woman who had once been so small in his eyes, standing before him, admired and successful. While he stood in the shadows, Rachel's voice broke through his thoughts, sharp and annoyed. "This isn't fair, Daniel. She was nothing before. And now she gets everything. And we're left with nothing." Daniel didn't respond right away. He just kept watching Helen, his eyes narrowing slightly. He hadn't realized it at first, but Rachel's bitterness stung him too. And as the event continued, it became painfully clear to him. He hadn't just lost his mother's love, he had lost a piece of himself in the process. This wasn't about Helen anymore. It was about the choices he had made, the way he had cast aside the one person who had always been there, just to placate his own selfishness. As the event came to an end, Helen mingled with the crowd, accepting congratulations from friends, colleagues, and new admirers. She felt a sense of peace, knowing that all of this, every success, every challenge, was her own. But as the night wore on, and the crowd began to thin, her thoughts turned back to Daniel and Rachel. She knew they would come to her eventually. She could feel it. Sure enough, when the last of the guests were beginning to leave, she spotted them across the room. Their faces were unreadable, masks of forced civility, but she knew them too well. They were here for one reason: to try to bring her back into their fold, to try to make amends for their cruelty. Helen didn't flinch. She didn't hesitate. She was ready. Daniel and Rachel approached her slowly, their movements stiff and awkward. The tension between them and her was palpable. It had been weeks, months, since she had seen them, and the space between them felt insurmountable. But they were here now, as she knew they would be. "Mom," Daniel began, his voice quieter now, stripped of the arrogance it had once held. "We were wrong. I was wrong. I should have treated you better." Rachel's expression softened, almost imperceptibly, as she added, We didn't understand. Not until now." Helen looked at them, her gaze unwavering. The applause still echoed in her mind, but her heart was calm. She wasn't the woman they had discarded anymore. "I've already forgiven you," she said, her voice steady and firm. "But I'm not going back. I'm not the same person anymore, and I'm not going to pretend that I am." The words hung between them, heavy with finality. Daniel opened his mouth to say something, but Helen shook her head, cutting him off. "I've made my peace. You'll have to make yours." And with that, she turned away from them, leaving them standing in the quiet, their presence now nothing more than a shadow of her past. As she walked toward the exit, the doors to the ballroom wide open in front of her, Helen felt the weight of the years lifting from her shoulders. She was free, and she wasn't looking back. Helen Carter's name was becoming known far beyond the quiet suburban neighborhood where she had once lived. Her candles, now a staple in homes across the country, had gone viral after being featured on a popular lifestyle website. What had started as a small craft business had bloomed into a thriving company, reaching new markets and securing deals with national retailers. The steady hum of the factory floor, the buzz of orders pouring in, and the expansion of her product lines filled her with an undeniable sense of accomplishment. She was living the dream she had once put on hold for everyone else. But this success wasn't just about the business, it was about the freedom that came with it. Helen's independence was her greatest treasure, a hard-won gift that she embraced every day. She had walked away from a life where she had been treated as an afterthought, and now she was creating a life where her own needs came first. The phone rang one afternoon as she sat at her desk in her new office. The walls were adorned with art from local women artists, each piece a reminder of her journey. The phone number was familiar. It was Daniel. She hesitated, but only for a second. Then she picked up the receiver, her fingers curling around the edge of the phone with an almost clinical detachment. "Hello?" she said, her voice even. "Mom." Daniel's voice was tentative, cautious, as if he had no idea how to approach her anymore. "We've been thinking. I think we need to talk. I know things got messed up between us, and I don't expect everything to go back to the way it was. But I'd like to try again. I think I've learned a lot, and I just want to see you." Helen took a deep breath, the old pang of guilt attempting to rise, but she crushed it down. She had made her decision long ago. "I'm glad you've learned something, Daniel," she said, her tone unwavering. "But I've already made my peace with what happened. I'm not going back to the person I was. I've worked too hard to get here, and I can't let anyone, not even you, pull me back into a life where I'm not valued." There was silence on the other end of the line, but she didn't waver. "You need to understand that I'm not the same person who would drop everything to help you anymore. I've moved on." A soft sigh from Daniel. "I understand, but I'm still your son, and I'd like to make things right. You don't have to do this alone." "I've never been alone," Helen replied firmly. "I'm surrounded by a community that values me, that sees me for who I am, not just as someone's mother or wife. I've built something for myself, and for once, that's enough." She hung up the phone without another word, the decision made. It wasn't easy, but it was right. Life moved on at a pace that felt exhilarating and surreal. Her business continued to thrive, reaching even greater heights. She had created an empire, but she never forgot where she came from. As she reached out to mentor young women in business, offering scholarships to those who needed the same opportunities she had never been given, she felt something stir in her heart. Purpose, power, and a sense of justice. She was paying forward the support she had once yearned for, but never received. The press loved her story. "From despair to triumph" became a tagline associated with her brand. She received countless interviews, but the most significant moment came when she was invited to accept an award for her entrepreneurial achievements. The Women's Empowerment Leadership Award was an honor she hadn't expected, but the moment she stepped onto that stage, something shifted. She was no longer just Helen Carter, the mother and wife who had sacrificed herself for her family. She was Helen Carter, the woman who had claimed her power and created a legacy that would endure. The applause was deafening as she took the stage. She looked out over the crowd, her heart full, her mind clear. This was her moment, and it was more than just recognition. It was proof that she had made the right choice. Meanwhile, Daniel's life had begun to stagnate. His career, once filled with promise, had plateaued. The law firm he worked for was losing clients, and his own reputation was beginning to suffer. He had tried to repair the damage with his mother, but the truth was undeniable. He had taken her for granted, and now he was reaping the consequences. He tried to make amends, but it was too late. Helen had built a life without him, and he could do nothing but watch from the sidelines. Rachel's life, too, began to unravel. Her social media empire, once a carefully curated facade of perfection, had started to crumble after a scandal involving a product endorsement gone wrong. The sponsors dropped her one by one, and the image she had carefully crafted began to fall apart. She became a target for gossip and criticism, and her once inflated sense of superiority started to deflate. Helen, on the other hand, had risen to the top without the need for a fabricated image. The contrast was stark. Helen didn't revel in their misfortune. She had moved beyond that. She had created a new life, and with it came the freedom to enjoy the things she had always dreamed of. She traveled to places she had only read about in books, experienced the world on her own terms, and filled her days with new adventures. There was no one holding her back anymore. But it wasn't just about the external success, it was the internal peace she had gained. Helen had found the strength to step into her own power, to define herself by her own terms, and to never again let anyone dictate her worth. And as she sat on a beach in Greece, watching the sun dip below the horizon, she smiled to herself. She had become everything they thought she couldn't be, and more. The life she had built was hers, and no one could take that away from her. The door to her old life had closed. The world before her was wide open. She had done it. And the best part? She had done it without them. The steady rhythm of Helen's days had transformed into something fluid and purposeful. Her candle business, now an empire of handmade eco-friendly creations, continued to soar. New products launched with every season: scented diffusers, natural wax melts, and even artisanal home decor. Her marketing strategies were sharp and precise, elevating her brand to new heights. Every campaign felt like a small revolution. She was no longer a footnote in someone else's story, but the author of her own. She'd expanded her product line to include workshops, where she taught others how to harness creativity and build a business from the ground up. The studio she'd opened in the heart of the city was a sanctuary, a hub for other like-minded individuals looking for guidance and inspiration. The walls were lined with works of art from local women, their stories now part of the tapestry she was weaving. She had created a safe space where dreams weren't just encouraged, they were nurtured. Every Tuesday and Thursday, Helen stood before a small group of aspiring entrepreneurs, guiding them through the steps of starting their own businesses. She'd been where they were once, lost, unsure, but desperate for a chance to prove herself. Now, she had become their mentor, a figure of strength and support. Each week, as she shared her lessons and experiences, she felt the weight of her own transformation. She wasn't just teaching them about business, she was teaching them how to trust themselves, how to step into their own power, and how to stop asking for permission to succeed. Her phone rang one day as she was preparing for a workshop. She glanced at the screen. It was Rachel's name. She hesitated only a moment before swiping the screen to silence the call. It had been months since their last exchange, and in that time, Helen's life had blossomed in ways she hadn't imagined. Rachel had reached out several times, sending texts and leaving messages, but each time, Helen ignored them. She wasn't angry. She had moved beyond that. But she wasn't going to let Rachel back into her life. Not when the air was thick with expectations and apologies that weren't hers to accept. Helen's success was undeniable, and it only grew with each passing day. Her business was featured in local magazines, hailed as one of the fastest-growing companies in the area. She was becoming a fixture in the community, sought after by local charities, interviewed for podcasts, and invited to give talks at conferences. It was a new world, a world she had built herself. And it felt right. It was hers. She stood in front of the window of her studio, watching the city come to life as evening fell. The streets below hummed with activity, but inside her space, it was calm. There was a quiet peace here, in her own success, in the knowledge that she had created something that mattered. She wasn't just a businesswoman, she was a leader, an advocate for women's empowerment, and a voice for those who had long been overlooked. But her rise was not without its challenges. Daniel's career, once a source of pride, had stagnated. The law firm he worked for was facing a decline in clients, and his own reputation was beginning to falter. He had tried to reach out to Helen again, but his messages had gone unanswered. As the months passed, he found himself watching from a distance as Helen's life unfolded in ways he had never imagined. He had underestimated her, had dismissed her strength when he had the chance. And now, as his own career hit a plateau, he couldn't help but wonder, what if I had treated her differently? Rachel, too, was struggling. Her carefully curated image as a successful influencer had started to crumble. The public scandal that had broken her social media empire was just the beginning. She had lost sponsors, and her once thriving online presence was now a shadow of its former self. Every day brought new headlines, each one a reminder that her brand was built on a foundation of lies. She tried to reach out to Helen again, seeking advice, but it was clear that she wasn't a part of Helen's world anymore, and the gap between them widened with every attempt. Helen's thoughts often wandered back to them, but she didn't linger there. Her success wasn't about revenge, it was about freedom. The lessons she had learned, about standing firm in her own worth, about never settling for less than what she deserved, were lessons she passed on to others. The young women in her workshops were living proof of that. Every new venture they started, every small victory, was a testament to the power she had helped them unlock within themselves. One evening, after a particularly moving session where one of her mentees shared her story of overcoming incredible odds to launch a successful online business, Helen found herself sitting in the quiet of her studio, reflecting. She thought of the times she had struggled to believe in herself, when her only identity was as a mother, as a wife. Now, she was more than that. She was her own person, with her own goals and dreams. She had learned to build her own future, and not just for herself, but for the women she mentored, for the community that had embraced her. A knock at the door startled her from her reverie. She opened it to find Sophie, her trusted employee, holding a bottle of champagne and a wide grin on her face. "You did it," Sophie said, her voice filled with excitement. "You're officially a finalist for the National Entrepreneur of the Year award." "This is huge, Helen." Helen took the bottle from Sophie with a laugh, the news sinking in slowly. This wasn't just about the accolades. It was the recognition of everything she had worked for. She wasn't just building a business. She was building a movement, a shift in the narrative. She was proving, every single day, that it was possible to rise from nothing, to reclaim your identity, and to do it on your own terms. As Sophie poured them both a glass, Helen stood there for a moment, looking out at the city. She could feel the weight of the journey behind her, but it no longer felt heavy. The door to her old life had long been closed. The future, full of possibilities, was wide open. And for the first time, Helen was ready to step fully into it, without fear, without hesitation. Helen stepped onto the stage, her heels clicking with confidence, her heart steady despite the weight of the moment. The audience's applause was deafening, but she took it in stride, the echo of her journey humming in her veins. It had been a long road from the quiet woman who had once been dismissed to the one standing before the cameras now, a role model, a leader in a room full of ambitious women eager to hear her story. The talk show host greeted her with enthusiasm, and the two women exchanged pleasantries before diving into the conversation. Helen's story of rising from the ashes, building a business from a small candle stand to a nationwide empire, was captivating. The audience hung on every word as she spoke, not just of her success, but of the battles she had fought, personal, professional, and emotional. Every challenge had shaped her, and now she wore each one like a badge of honor. As the conversation flowed, Helen realized that this was more than just an interview. This was her moment to show women everywhere what was possible when you decided to believe in yourself, when you refused to be defined by the roles others tried to impose on you. She wasn't just talking about candles anymore. She was talking about empowerment, independence, and the unshakable power of a woman who had chosen her own path. Your story is incredible, the host said, after a particularly moving part of the interview. But it's not just about business, is it? You've become a beacon for women everywhere. Helen smiled, her eyes shining with a quiet pride. It's about more than candles, yes. It's about creating space for women to thrive. Whether it's in business, in the home, or in society, we all deserve to carve out a place where we are valued and heard. That's what I'm building now, not just a company, but a community. As the interview wrapped up, Helen was handed a small envelope by her assistant. She opened it quickly, her pulse quickening. It was an offer, a lucrative one, from a national retailer who wanted to carry her products in stores nationwide. It was everything she'd worked for, everything she had dreamed about when she had first started making candles at her kitchen table. She could feel the weight of the offer in her hands. This was not just about financial gain. This was about true recognition of her brand and the community she had built. After the show, Helen received a flurry of congratulatory messages from old friends, new acquaintances, and even strangers who had seen the interview. The applause was still echoing in her mind as she stood in her dressing room, a glass of water in hand, watching the notifications flood in. She was living proof that it was possible to turn your life around, to create something meaningful from the ashes of your past. Meanwhile, Daniel and Rachel sat in a sterile office, both watching the show on their phones, each in their own space, processing what they had just witnessed. Rachel's face was unreadable, her fingers twitching slightly as she scrolled through the online articles and social media posts about Helen's success. "What the hell just happened?" she muttered under her breath, the words more to herself than to Daniel. "She's everywhere now." Daniel was quiet beside her, staring at his screen, his mind racing. He had seen it coming, hadn't he? Deep down, he had known that his mother had something in her, something more than he had ever realized. The truth of it now, seeing her receive the admiration, the success, the respect, felt like a punch in the gut. His own career had plateaued. The law firm's business was dwindling, and his attempts to fix the damage he'd caused with Helen were falling flat. He had misjudged her. He had underestimated the woman who had always been there for him. And now, he couldn't help but wonder, what if I had been different? Rachel, in her frustration, had already typed and deleted several texts to Helen, but she couldn't find the words. She had underestimated Helen's ability to rise above the chaos they had created. The jealousy began to swirl as she realized that her own carefully curated image was fading. While Helen thrived, Rachel's social media following was slowly dwindling. The sponsors who had once lined up to partner with her were now jumping ship, afraid of the scandal that had followed her in its wake. Her facade of perfection was crumbling, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. Helen's phone buzzed as she sat in her office reflecting on the day. It was Daniel, his name flashing on the screen. She knew what he wanted. She had been expecting this moment. He had made his attempts before, but she knew the time had passed. She took a breath and answered the call, her tone measured but kind. "Hello, Daniel." "Mom." His voice sounded heavier than usual, and she could hear the hesitation in his words. "I've been thinking about everything, about how I treated you, and I'm sorry. I should have done better. Please, let me make it right. Can we meet?" Helen leaned back in her chair, her gaze steady. She had moved past this moment long ago. She had made peace with what happened, but there was no turning back now. "I appreciate your apology, Daniel," she said, her voice soft but firm. "But I've built something for myself. I'm not the woman I was when you kicked me out. I'm not going back to that life. There was a pause on the other end, and she could hear him take a deep breath. She knew he was frustrated, that he wanted things to return to how they had been. But she wasn't the same person anymore. Goodbye, Daniel, she said gently, but resolutely. I've already made my peace. It's time for you to do the same. She ended the call, her heart steady but full. This was the moment she had waited for, the moment she could fully embrace her power. She had created the life she wanted, and nothing, no one, could take that away from her. Helen looked out the window, watching the sun dip below the horizon. Her success was not just about money, accolades, or fame. It was about the freedom to live authentically, to create a future on her own terms. And as she closed her eyes, she smiled, knowing that she had finally built something that was all hers. Helen leaned against the marble countertop in her new kitchen, the soft hum of the city outside her window a constant reminder that this was her life now. A life built from the ground up. A life that had once felt impossible. But now, as she sipped her coffee, it felt like everything had finally aligned. Her dream realized in the form of a sun-drenched apartment overlooking the skyline. She had left behind the small, cramped space she had once called home, a place filled with memories of limitations and unspoken regrets. Now she stood in a home that echoed with possibility, a true reflection of her success and independence. The new home was more than just a place to live. It was a symbol of everything she had fought for. The walls were lined with art that she had once only dreamed of collecting, the spaces filled with the things that mattered most: books, candles, plants, and soft lighting that made everything feel warm, inviting. It was everything she had wanted, but never thought she deserved. And now it was hers. She stepped out onto the terrace, taking in the view of the city below. The sunset painted the sky with hues of pink and orange, a perfect reflection of her life right now. She had worked hard for this moment, fought battles both within and without, and now she could finally breathe. With a smile, Helen pulled out her phone and began to scroll through her social media. The following she had gained was not just from business success, but from her story. People were inspired, not just by her candles, but by her journey. As she posted pictures of her new home and some of her latest products, the messages poured in. Women, young and old, telling her how she had inspired them to pursue their own dreams, how they were no longer afraid to stand up for themselves. But it wasn't just her followers who had noticed her transformation. Daniel had been persistent. She had expected it, even anticipated the moment he would come, but she wasn't sure she was ready to hear him out again. That morning, as she was organizing a charity event for women entrepreneurs, there was a knock on the door. She opened it to find Daniel standing on the other side, holding a bouquet of flowers in his hands, his face marked by the uncertainty of someone trying to right past wrongs. "Mom," he began, his voice soft. "I know I've messed up. I just wanted to see you again, to make things right. I know it's been a long time, but I don't want us to be strangers anymore. I'm sorry. I want to be a part of your life again." Helen's gaze didn't falter as she looked at him, her posture firm yet calm. She had come so far from the woman who would have apologized for her own success, from the woman who would have allowed herself to be pulled back into a toxic cycle of guilt and obligation. She took a deep breath, letting the air fill her lungs before speaking. "I've already found my peace, Daniel," she said, her voice steady. "I've made the choice to live for myself now. The life I have built, the person I've become, isn't something I'm willing to compromise. I've done all I can. I'm not going back to what we were." He stood there, holding the flowers, the weight of her words sinking in. His face softened, but Helen could see the sorrow in his eyes. It was too late, and he knew it. "Goodbye, Daniel," she said gently but firmly, before turning back into her apartment, closing the door softly behind her. She didn't feel a shred of regret. This was her moment, her life, and she was no longer bound by anyone else's expectations. Inside, Helen ran her fingers over the soft fabric of her new couch, a couch she had bought with the profits from her business, with money she had earned, not from anyone's charity. Her phone buzzed again, and this time, it was Rachel. Helen hesitated. The brief thoughts of the woman who had once been so envious of her success were quickly brushed aside. Rachel had tried to stay relevant by using her family image, but it no longer worked. Her carefully cultivated social media presence was unraveling, and people saw the truth. Rachel's life had been an illusion. She couldn't keep up the charade of perfection, not when Helen had exposed the power of authenticity. Helen didn't pick up. Rachel had done too much damage to their relationship. She had been part of the reason Helen had lost herself in the first place. It wasn't her job to fix Rachel. It wasn't her job to continue living in the shadows of others. Instead, Helen took a moment to reflect. She had an entire world ahead of her, and it wasn't defined by anyone else's vision but her own. She had a TEDx talk to prepare for, a platform where she would speak not just about entrepreneurship, but about reclaiming your life. She would tell her story of survival, of empowerment, of the freedom that came when she finally learned to say no. The invitation was the culmination of everything she had fought for. It wasn't just an opportunity, it was a responsibility. To show women that their stories mattered, that they too could build the lives they wanted. As she sat in her new home preparing for the talk, she reflected on how far she had come. She had built a legacy, not of candles or products, but of a movement, a community of empowered women who no longer saw themselves as less. She was a leader, an example of what it meant to choose yourself, to walk away from the expectations of others, and to rise into the life you deserve. Helen smiled, her heart full as she prepared for the next chapter of her journey. She had already found the peace she had long sought, and now she was ready to share it with the world. The future was hers, and she was ready to embrace it completely. The sound of Helen's name echoed through Daniel's mind like a persistent whisper he couldn't escape. Every new headline, every success story, her success story, felt like a punch in the gut. He sat in his office, staring at the screen as his phone lit up with another news article about her. A new feature in Forbes about her business expansion. A glowing write-up about her upcoming TEDx talk. He could feel the weight of it all. The weight of his actions, his dismissal of her, the words he had never taken back. Rachel sat across from him, her phone clutched tightly in her hands, her lips drawn in a tight line. She hadn't said much lately, not since everything had begun to unravel for her. The influencer brand she had so carefully built was slowly collapsing. Once a powerhouse in the social media world, she now found herself the subject of ridicule, her carefully constructed image falling apart piece by piece. "Look at this," she muttered, her voice thin with frustration. She thrust her phone at him, showing him a tweet. A comment thread from someone calling her out for the way she had treated Helen. Daniel glanced at the screen, the words stinging. "I never thought it would go like this," he admitted quietly. "I thought I could just move on, put it behind us. But now I see it. I see how much I hurt her." He had been too wrapped up in his own life, too concerned with impressing Rachel and securing his own future, to realize that the person who had always had his back, who had always been there for him, Helen, was being cast aside for the wrong reasons. His drive to prove himself had led him down the path of alienating the one person who truly cared. "I should have never let you get away with it," Rachel finally spoke, her words venomous but weak. "We never needed her anyway. You have me, right?" "Why would you want to let her back in?" Daniel's face hardened. "You don't get it, Rachel. It's not about you. It's about her. I was the one who let her go." His voice trembled with frustration, a stark contrast to his usual confident demeanor. "I pushed her out because I was too focused on our image, on looking good in front of you, on everything that didn't matter. And now, she's thriving. Without me. Without us." Rachel's expression softened for a moment, then hardened again. She knew he was right. She knew that her treatment of Helen hadn't helped her own public standing either. After all, the public had turned on Rachel just as quickly as they had turned to Helen. The superficiality of her social media, the constant push for perfection, had become transparent. Sponsors had begun to drop her, and her follower count was dipping lower with every passing week. It was no longer the empire she had once ruled. It was a crumbling house of cards. Daniel stood, pacing the small office. "I made the mistake of thinking that she was the one who needed me. But it was me all along. She didn't need me. She was the one holding us together. And now I've lost her. And it's my fault." He stopped pacing, his eyes distant. "I should have been proud of her. Instead, I just let my insecurities control everything." The silence in the room was heavy, thick with regret. It hung there, pressing on both of them. The life they had so carefully curated seemed to be slipping away. All the while, Helen's star rose higher, each moment a reminder of the life they had pushed her out of. Across town, Helen's life was flourishing, and she couldn't have been more content. She had long since stopped worrying about the people who hadn't valued her, who hadn't seen her potential. Now, surrounded by a group of fierce women entrepreneurs she had mentored, Helen found herself in a place of deep gratitude. She had come so far. Her business was thriving beyond anything she'd ever imagined, and the new opportunities kept rolling in. She didn't dwell on her past. She focused on what she had built. Her workshops, her speaking engagements, her books. Everything she had created was a testament to her journey. She was no longer a quiet presence in her own life. She was a leader, a voice for women who had been ignored and undervalued. Her new friends and colleagues continued to elevate her, and as she stood before a crowded room one evening, accepting an award for her contributions to women's entrepreneurship, she realized just how much had changed. She no longer felt invisible. She no longer needed to prove anything to anyone. The speech she gave that night was a reflection of her truth. She spoke about overcoming self-doubt, about the courage it took to rebuild a life from nothing. She spoke about freedom, not just the freedom to build a business, but the freedom to be who you truly were, without apology. As the applause rang out in the room, Helen took a deep breath, her heart full. There was no trace of regret in her, no longing to go back to the way things had been. She had already found everything she needed, inside herself. And in that moment, she knew that her true power wasn't just in the success she had built, but in the choice she had made, the choice to never look back again. The past was behind her, and the future, her future, was hers to create. Helen stood at the front of the room, the soft hum of conversations fading as the crowd's attention focused on her. The atmosphere felt different now, charged, electric with the weight of the moment. It wasn't just another talk. This wasn't just a room full of women listening to a success story. It was the beginning of a movement. The nonprofit event she had partnered with was designed to help women entrepreneurs gain access to the resources, education, and funding they needed to start and grow their businesses. As she spoke, Helen could feel the power of her words settle into the room. She wasn't just sharing her story anymore. She was giving them permission to tell theirs. "Every woman here has something valuable to offer," she said, her voice clear and unwavering. "It's not about waiting for the right time or the right person to tell you that you're enough. You have everything you need right now. The world doesn't need you to be perfect. It needs you to be bold, to take the leap, even when the path ahead feels uncertain. That's how we change the world. The room erupted into applause, and for a moment, Helen closed her eyes, letting the warmth of the crowd's approval wash over her. She had worked for this, earned this, and now she was giving back. Not just through business, but through mentorship and support for women who had once been invisible, just like she had been. Her journey had brought her here, and now she had a platform to change the lives of others. She was living her purpose, not just as an entrepreneur, but as a catalyst for others to rise. And it felt like the best reward of all. Her influence was spreading fast. What had started as a small community of women supporting one another had blossomed into something much larger: national recognition, collaborations with nonprofit organizations, partnerships with influencers who truly believed in empowerment. But none of that mattered more than the lives she was touching directly. The mothers who had always felt stuck in their circumstances now saw a way out. The women who had been told no too many times were finally hearing yes. Helen's latest initiative, offering scholarships to single mothers and women from underserved communities to take business courses, had launched with tremendous success. The first cohort of women had already started their classes, many of them overwhelmed by the opportunity to finally pursue their own dreams. As Helen watched the women she mentored rise, so too did her own recognition. Her name was becoming synonymous with change, with empowerment. The press followed her everywhere, from her involvement in local business incubators to the many awards she was nominated for. One of her proudest moments came when her book, From Broken to Bold, hit the shelves. It was a raw, authentic look at her journey, detailing not only her rise from a low point, but also the lessons she'd learned about reclaiming one's life. The book quickly became a bestseller, praised for its honesty, its vulnerability, and its unflinching message that failure wasn't an end, but a beginning. Critics lauded it as a new kind of business book, one that didn't just talk about profit margins and strategies, but about the emotional and psychological resilience needed to truly succeed. It was at the launch of her book that Daniel first saw her, really saw her, for the woman she had become. Standing in the audience at a speaking engagement in New York, he felt a mixture of pride, awe, and regret. Pride because she had made it. She was thriving, living the life he should have been proud to support. Awe because he had always thought she was just the quiet mother who put everyone else first. He never realized how much she had hidden beneath the surface, how much strength she'd kept for herself. But as he watched the way people gravitated toward her, the way women hung on every word she said, he couldn't ignore the gut-wrenching sense of loss. He had dismissed her when she needed him most, and now, her success was a reminder of the love he had lost. His thoughts shifted when he saw Rachel sitting nearby, her face tense. Rachel's social media presence, once a polished image of perfection, had now turned into a chaotic mess. The sponsors who had once lined up to work with her had begun to back out, and her followers were growing disillusioned with her carefully crafted persona. Her every attempt to regain relevance, from sponsored posts to influencer partnerships, felt hollow, like she was chasing a past that wasn't coming back. Rachel had tried reaching out to Helen several times, but each attempt had been met with silence. Helen's refusal to engage had only made Rachel feel more desperate, more fragile. She couldn't understand it. She had always been the one people admired, the one who had been the driving force in her life. But now, with Helen's success, it felt like she had been relegated to the sidelines. As Helen stood on that stage, basking in the warmth of her community, she knew she had done the right thing. The past had no hold over her anymore. There were no regrets, no looking back. Every choice she had made had led her here, to a place where she could not only thrive, but also inspire others to do the same. Helen's thoughts wandered to the future, as they often did now. Her work wasn't done. There were more women to help, more lives to touch. She had built a legacy, yes, but that legacy was just beginning to take shape. The world needed more of this, more authenticity, more courage, and more women stepping into their own power. But even as she reveled in her own success, there was a quiet understanding that Daniel and Rachel's journey was far from over. Their regret, so evident, so raw, was part of their own process. They had to find their own way, just as she had. And as Helen walked off the stage that day, the applause still echoing in her ears, she felt something deep inside her stir. A quiet knowing that the impact she had made would reverberate far beyond the walls of that room. Her journey wasn't just about her anymore. It was about everyone who was watching, learning, and, most importantly, rising. The future was hers, and now it was theirs too. Helen watched the horizon as her private jet glided smoothly through the sky. The early morning sun painted the clouds with colors of gold and pink, an almost perfect reflection of her life. She had worked hard for this, truly earned every moment of it. Her name was no longer just a whisper in local communities. It was a household name, one that was synonymous with empowerment, resilience, and innovation. Her candle business, once a dream formed in her kitchen, had grown into a national powerhouse, with contracts spanning across the country. Her products were now found in stores everywhere, from luxury boutiques to major retailers. But it wasn't just the financial success that mattered. What Helen had built was a movement. Her business wasn't just about candles, it was about lighting the way for other women to find their paths, to rise above the limitations that had been placed on them, and to find the strength they didn't even know they had. And now, it was time for the next chapter. The nonprofit organization she had founded, Rise Together, had just launched its first major initiative, helping women in underdeveloped areas start their own businesses. This wasn't just charity, it was opportunity. With microloans, training, and mentorship, Helen was giving women the tools they needed to succeed, no matter where they came from. She had learned long ago that success wasn't just about having the right resources, it was about creating a community, about empowering others to create their own futures. The first group of women in the program had already launched their own businesses. Helen visited several of the locations in Africa and South America herself, witnessing firsthand the power of opportunity to change lives. Seeing the transformation in these women, who had once been told they were too weak, too poor, too unworthy, was the most gratifying success of all. While Helen's heart swelled with pride for what she had built, Daniel was sitting in his office, staring out the window, his mind elsewhere. He had spent years buried in his career, his pride and ambitions blinding him to the value of the people in his life, especially his mother. Watching her rise to such incredible heights had left him with a deep, gnawing regret. He had dismissed her. He had pushed her out, believing his own desires for success and approval were more important than the love and wisdom she had offered. Now, everything had changed. His career, once on a clear path to success, was faltering. The law firm was losing clients, and his efforts to climb the corporate ladder seemed to be reaching a dead end. He had thought he could do it alone, thought he could build his life without her. But now, he knew the cost of his actions. Sitting in his office, Daniel finally made the decision. He had to change. He had to make things right. Not just with Helen, but with himself. He started reaching out to old mentors, seeking guidance on how to repair the damage he had caused. He started reading the books Helen had written, books that spoke of resilience, of healing, of starting over. His transformation was gradual, but it was real. He realized that success wasn't just about ambition and external accolades. It was about humility, empathy, and the relationships you nurtured along the way. But he also understood that there was nothing he could do to reverse the damage he'd done to his relationship with his mother. That bridge had been burned, and though he could change and grow, he knew that Helen's life was no longer tethered to him. Meanwhile, Rachel, who had once been Helen's greatest critic, found herself in a situation she hadn't anticipated. Her carefully crafted persona, her influencer empire, had crumbled beneath the weight of the scandal that had plagued her career. The sponsorships had disappeared, and her once booming brand had become irrelevant. But the public backlash wasn't just about her career, it was about her actions. The way she had treated Helen, the way she had dismissed her. Now she found herself struggling to pick up the pieces of a life she had built on a foundation of vanity. Rachel, in her desperation, reached out to Helen again. This time, it was private. No public statements, no grand gestures, just a simple message. "I'm sorry, Helen. I was wrong. I know that now. Please, let me be a part of your life again." Helen sat in her office when she saw the message come through. There was a brief moment of hesitation, of reflection on what Rachel had meant to her in the past, of the woman she had once been. But Helen had moved on. She had already closed that chapter of her life. The apology came too late. With a deep breath, she typed her reply. "I've made peace with everything, Rachel. But I've moved on. I've built a life for myself, and I no longer need to be involved in yours. I hope you understand." She hit send, and the weight of the decision lifted. No longer did she need to keep revisiting the past. She had already created the life she deserved, the life she had fought for. As the plane touched down, Helen felt a deep sense of fulfillment. She had given herself the space to live the life she had always wanted: freedom, peace, and the opportunity to leave a legacy. She was spending more time with friends now, people who truly understood her and supported her. She was traveling the world, experiencing new cultures, and indulging in the adventures she had once put aside. Helen was living for herself now, no longer defined by anyone else's expectations. Her foundation was thriving, reaching women in places she'd never dreamed possible. She was creating opportunities for future generations of women to stand on their own, to speak their truths, and to claim the success that was rightfully theirs. And as she stepped out into the bright sunlight, walking confidently towards the next chapter of her journey, she realized something profound. She was exactly where she was meant to be. The future was no longer a distant dream. It was happening now. And this time, she was in full control. The grand hall was filled with anticipation, the sound of footsteps mingling with low conversations and the clink of glasses. It was the Women's Empowerment Gala, an event that celebrated the tireless contributions of women who had made a significant impact on the world. Helen stood at the back of the room, watching the crowd, the weight of the evening settling into her bones. Her hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the gravity of the moment. She had arrived. Helen had come a long way since the day she had been cast aside by her own son, a woman with nothing but her dreams and determination. Now, she was standing on the precipice of something even bigger, an acknowledgement of her journey, of the work she had poured into the world. The host's voice cut through her thoughts. "And now, we welcome the recipient of this year's Women's Empowerment Award, a woman whose story of resilience and transformation has inspired thousands, Helen Carter." The applause was thunderous, and Helen felt her heart race as she walked to the stage, her heels clicking on the polished floor. The spotlight hit her, and for a moment, the world outside faded. She stepped up to the podium, her breath steady, her chest filled with pride and gratitude. "I don't know where to begin," Helen said into the microphone, the crowd quieting as they leaned in. "When I started this journey, I had no idea where it would lead. I was just a woman trying to make a living, trying to make a difference. And I've learned something incredibly important along the way. The only limits we have are the ones we place on ourselves." The room erupted in applause once more, and Helen felt her resolve solidify. This was her moment, not just to be celebrated, but to inspire others to break free from the constraints they had lived under. She was no longer the invisible woman who had spent years supporting everyone else. She was the woman who had chosen herself, who had risen despite the odds. Behind her, Daniel and Rachel sat, the sharp contrast of their own decline evident as they watched her from a distance. They had attended the gala, not because they belonged in the spotlight anymore, but because they had nowhere else to go. The crowd barely noticed them, their presence little more than a faint shadow in the background. Daniel sat stiffly in his chair, his eyes never leaving Helen as she spoke. He watched as she shared her story with the world, recounting her struggles, her moments of doubt, and the choices she had made that had led her to this point. The woman who had once been dismissed as nothing more than a mother and a wife was now a leader, a figurehead for change. He felt a pang in his chest, one that he could never undo. He had been the one who had pushed her away, who had discarded her when she needed him most. Rachel, sitting beside him, looked smaller than she had ever seemed before. Her perfect image had been shattered, her social media empire now a relic of her past. She had tried to rebuild, tried to reclaim some semblance of control, but the damage was done. The world had moved on without her. And here she was, sitting beside Daniel, a distant observer in the life of the woman they had both underestimated. Helen finished her speech, and the applause surged again. The award was hers, but so much more than that was reflected in the faces of the women who had gathered around her, the women whose lives she had touched. She wasn't just a businesswoman anymore. She was a movement. And that movement was growing stronger every day. Later, as the gala continued around her, Helen found herself standing at a corner of the hall, watching the new generation of entrepreneurs speak with excitement and passion about their own dreams. She realized that this was the real reward, the work she had done, the impact she had made. It wasn't the award. It wasn't the recognition. It was the change she had created. Behind her, Daniel and Rachel watched from a distance, their eyes filled with unspoken emotions. For the first time, they truly saw her, not as a mother, not as someone to be manipulated, but as a force to be reckoned with. Helen was no longer just the woman who had once taken their abuse. She had become a symbol of resilience, of strength, and of self-determination. And now, they could only watch as she rose higher. Rachel opened her mouth to speak, but the words died on her tongue. She had nothing left to say, nothing left to offer. Helen had moved beyond their reach, and she knew it. There would be no reconciliation. Not now, not ever. Helen, on the other hand, had long since made her peace. She had closed the door on the past, not in bitterness, but in quiet confidence. The future, her future, was limitless, and nothing could drag her back into the shadows of her old life. She was creating a legacy, one that would outlive her, one that would continue to empower women long after she was gone. And as she walked away from the crowd, feeling the weight of her accomplishments settle into her bones, she realized that her true success wasn't measured in awards or accolades. It was in the lives she had touched, the women she had helped rise, and the world she had begun to change. The future was bright, and it was all hers. Helen stood at the edge of the mountain ridge, the cool wind whipping through her hair as she looked out at the sprawling landscape below. The world felt vast, limitless, just like her future. The snow-capped peaks in the distance were a stark contrast to the warmth of the sun that bathed the valley, and the air felt different here, crisp, pure, untainted by the noise of the world she had left behind. It was the kind of peace she had spent her whole life chasing, the kind of peace that only came when you had finally freed yourself from the weight of everyone else's expectations. She had worked hard for this moment, harder than she had ever worked for anything in her life. When she had first started, she hadn't known how far she would go, but she had believed in the simple idea that she could build something from nothing, and she had. What started as a small candle-making business in a cramped apartment had evolved into a nationwide empire, a business that now spanned industries and transformed lives. The road had been long, full of obstacles and setbacks, but she had walked it on her own terms, with no one to hold her back. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, but she didn't need to check it. She had long stopped chasing the notifications, the validation. What mattered now was the stillness, the quiet satisfaction of knowing that she had built a life that was truly hers. Her work, her voice, her influence. It was all her own. No longer defined by others, no longer molded by anyone's vision but her own. She turned to walk away from the edge, making her way to the small cabin where she was staying. A small fire crackled in the hearth, and the smell of pine and cedar filled the air. It was peaceful here, a far cry from the bustling cities and constant demands of her empire. But even here, she felt the hum of purpose, the knowledge that her work was never done. The women she mentored were thriving. Her nonprofit, Rise Together, was expanding, helping even more women around the world build their own businesses, their own futures. Back in the city, Daniel and Rachel had faded from her life. Not through any dramatic actions, but through simple neglect. She no longer looked for their validation, no longer cared whether they saw her success. They were ghosts in her past, faded memories of a life she had long outgrown. She had once hoped for their approval, even their acknowledgement, but she had come to realize that their rejection had been a blessing in disguise. She was no longer weighed down by their expectations, their criticisms, or their need for her to remain in the background. She had learned that true freedom came not from their acceptance, but from her ability to rise on her own, from the strength she had built within herself. Helen's thoughts shifted to the invitation that had arrived just the day before, a global ambassador role for women's entrepreneurship. It was an honor, one she hadn't expected, but it felt like the natural next step. She had always dreamed of reaching women on a global scale, of using her platform to advocate for real change. Now she was poised to make an even greater impact, not just as a businesswoman, but as a voice for women around the world who still felt invisible, who still faced barriers she had once faced herself. As she sat on the cabin's porch, looking out at the mountains, she thought about how much she had changed. From the woman who had once doubted herself to the one now shaping industries, mentoring hundreds of women, and standing as a symbol of success in every way. She had built a legacy, one that would outlast her. She had outlived the doubts, outlasted the voices that told her she wasn't enough. She had done it without the people who had once tried to hold her back, without their approval, without their help. And that was the greatest revenge. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, Helen smiled. She didn't look back. Not once. The world was at her feet, and she was exactly where she was meant to be. They thought I couldn't do it, she whispered to herself, her voice barely audible against the wind. But I built a life they can only envy, and I did it without them. And with that, she turned and walked back into the warmth of the cabin, knowing that the future was hers to shape.